We're beginning a new teaching series called the Makarioi, which is a strange title for a teaching series, but it's actually a Greek word. It's the plural of Makarios, which doesn't help you a whole lot. It's the word that we translate blessed when we read in Matthew the Beatitudes. Blessed are, blessed is. And the reason I've called it that is that we need to understand a little bit more fully what that word means. We tend to think the Beatitudes are kind of statements about being happy. Happy is the person who, sort of thing. But it's more than that, and we'll explore that a little through the series. But beyond that, we actually need to kind of back off and ask, well, why do we study the Beatitudes? What place do they have in our lives? And that's pertinent for me because in my theological education, I was basically left with the understanding that the Beatitudes didn't really matter. I mean, they did, but they didn't, in this sense, that the Sermon on the Mount, and in fact, much of the teaching of Matthew, I was taught, was about the future. It was about what it would be like when the kingdom of God really comes, which in my formation was always going to be in the future. Usually it was construed as something that would happen in the 1,000-year period of time in which Jesus reigns. And so the Sermon on the Mount, and then in specific the Beatitudes, were kind of the constitution of that new kingdom. But you kind of didn't need to pay much attention to it now. Rather go to the Pauline letters, for example, which are about the church and to the church, than get into the Sermon on the Mount, because it really is about the future. Since then, I've learned a lot from a theologian called Tom Wright, and he's helped me understand that, in fact, the kingdom of God is not just something that's going to happen in the future, but something that was inaugurated by Jesus and is continuing to grow and become as we live our Christian lives here on earth. It's not something that we should be waiting for. We should actually be living into the kingdom of God. And so the Beatitudes then are not always about the future, but they're actually about the present. And then that brings us back to the things that Jesus said, and we begin to wonder about what these Beatitudes mean in the present, as well as when they are realized fully as people live in the kingdom. And there have been various extremes, really, in interpreting them. Some have said that they can be kind of spiritualized, and they have like a spiritual meaning. And others have said, well, they're kind of ideals, that if we were really living in the presence of God, we would live like this. And so at best they become kind of aspirations, that kind of, wouldn't it be nice if this were true? In my understanding now of the Beatitudes, and as I go back and try to understand Jesus in his world at his time, preaching the Sermon on the Mount, it sounds as though Jesus really means what he said. And that seems very silly to say for me, but when we read the Beatitudes, we might be inclined to think, well, he's not serious, right? Is this like hyperbole, an exaggeration? Is this a sarcastic set of things that he's saying, or what is it? And more I'm coming to believe that he really meant these things. He really meant them for people who are his followers. And so even though they are radical, we will discover that they really disclose a whole new economy and a whole new sense of politics, a whole new sense of self, as Jesus expected his followers to follow him this way. So in a book by Scott McKnight, he says that understanding the word understands that the word means a description of the kind of people characteristic of the New Age brought by Christ. The New Age has been brought by Christ. We are people in that New Age, and it should be characteristic of us that we are like the description in Matthew chapter 5 that we call the Beatitudes. And so we're going to have a hard look at what that means and try to understand how it is that the people who are followers of Christ would be characterized by these statements. Things like being meek, things like being poor, things like being persecuted and enduring. How are they going to be characteristic of our lives? And what do we need to live into so that they might, in fact, describe us? So we're going to enjoy having a look at the Beatitudes one by one, and we will listen to them and ask ourselves, is Christ serious about this? If he is, what difference would that make in my life, in our lives, in our community? And how would we then be shaped into the kind of people characteristic of those in the New Age brought by Christ? We'll see that each of the Beatitudes also has a promise that if we do live this way, there is something that we should expect. And we'll be summing up what all of those promises are and looking forward to and looking into the ways in which they will characterize our lives and our community. So I hope you'll join us and enjoy this deep dive into the Beatitudes, the Makarioi. You'll learn to say that word. Thanks.